It was a cold night in Hollywood, the kind that made the city feel even more deserted than usual. The streets, usually alive with lights and noise, were eerily quiet as I drove home from my late shift as a manager at a small restaurant. I had been working extra hours to cover for a colleague who was out sick, and by the time I finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. My eyes were heavy, and my mind was foggy from exhaustion. All I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the long night. As I turned onto Cana Boulevard, the streetlights cast long, stretching shadows across the road. The buildings loomed on either side, dark and silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The air felt thick, like something was hanging in it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, chalking it up to fatigue. I was just tired, I told myself. Nothing more. I slowed down as I approached a stop sign about 3 blocks from Hollywood Boulevard. I knew this area well. I had driven through it countless times, but tonight something felt different. The stillness was unnerving, and the only sound was the hum of my car's engine. As I rolled to a stop, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. From both sides of the street, a group of men began to appear. They strolled casually, almost too casually, toward the crosswalk, coming from the shadows, like they had been waiting there. There were at least 5 or 6 of them, and they were all dressed in dark clothes. My heart started to race as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Their faces were obscured in the dim light, but their intentions were clear in the way they moved, deliberate, slow, like predators circling their prey. Panic welled up inside me as they reached the edges of the crosswalk. My instincts screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body felt frozen in place. The men were getting closer, spreading out across the road as if to block my path. Time seemed to slow down, every second stretching out unbearably as they advanced. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, without thinking, my foot slammed down on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the pavement as my car lurched forward, and I ran the stop sign, speeding through the intersection. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of their faces as they realized what I was doing. Twisted in anger, mouths open in curses I couldn't hear over the roar of the engine. They started running after me, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting away, getting to safety. The car hurtled down the street, the speedometer climbing higher and higher as I tore through the quiet neighborhoods. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me alert, but a chill had settled in my bones, a deep, cold fear that refused to leave. I didn't slow down until I was several blocks away, and even then I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those men chasing after me. But the streets behind me were empty, as silent and still as they had been before. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the whole thing had been some sort of waking nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. I could still feel the cold sweat on my skin, the echo of their footsteps in my mind. I finally pulled over in a well-lit area, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. I sat there in the driver's seat, trying to calm my racing heart, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Those men, what were they planning to do? The answer was too terrifying to fully consider, but deep down I knew they were ready to jack me, maybe worse. If I hadn't reacted, if I had hesitated even for a moment, I shuddered to think of what could have happened. I replayed the scene in my head, the way they moved, how they seemed to come out of nowhere, the cold malice in their eyes. Everything about it felt wrong, like I had narrowly escaped something truly dark and evil. I had always heard stories about how dangerous the city could be at night, but I had never truly believed it, until now. It wasn't until I got home and locked the door behind me that I finally allowed myself to breathe. The safety of my small apartment felt fragile, like a thin barrier between me and the horrors that lurked outside. And every time I drive through that part of town, I can't help but feel that same creepy encounter, a reminder of how close I came to something unspeakable. Before we get into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I live in a safe country, and my city is known for being one of the safest. The streets are quiet, crime is almost non-existent, and people don't worry much about safety. My name is Mark, and I'm a photographer. Sometimes my work keeps me out late. On some nights, I don't get home until 2 or 4 in the morning. It's usually peaceful, and I never felt uneasy coming home at those hours. My parents lived in a group of attached houses built into a hill, and below the houses were our parking spots. The area was always silent after midnight, with no one around. It felt like the safest place in the world. One cold night, I was driving home after a long day of work. My eyes were tired, and all I wanted was to crawl into bed. As I turned into the parking area, the headlights of my car illuminated the row of vehicles parked under the hill. Everything seemed normal, but then I saw something that made me slow down. A figure was moving between the cars. It was strange to see someone there at that hour. No one else should have been around. The person was moving slowly, almost as if they were sneaking around, trying not to be noticed. My first thought was that maybe it was a neighbor who had forgotten something in their car, but something about the way they moved felt off. I parked my car, keeping an eye on the figure. They were still moving between the cars, but now they seemed to be checking the doors, like they were trying to find one that was unlocked. My heart started to race as I realized that this person wasn't a neighbor. They were up to something that didn't belong in this quiet, safe place. I got out of my car, and the cold air hit me immediately. It was freezing, the kind of night where you could see your breath. The figure was still there, and now I could see him more clearly. He was wearing just a pair of shorts and a short-sleeve shirt, totally out of place in this weather. He was skinny, almost unnaturally so, and he moved with a strange kind of energy, like he couldn't stay still. This was my home, my safe place, and I wasn't going to let some stranger make me feel scared. I walked towards him, determined to find out what he was doing. "Hey!" I called out, my voice louder than I expected in the stillness of the night. "What are you doing?" The man turned to face me, and for a moment I regretted approaching him. His eyes were wide, and his pupils were huge, like black holes taking up most of his eyes. It was unnatural, unsettling. He didn't look at me like a normal person would. His gaze was intense, almost desperate. There was something wrong with him, something that made my skin crawl. He started walking towards me fast, with an aggressive energy that made my heart pound. For a split second I thought about running back to my car, but then he spoke. "What's up?" he said, his voice rough and shaky. I could see him more clearly now. He was thin, too thin, with his bones almost poking through his skin. His clothes were loose and didn't seem to offer him any warmth. The way he moved, the way he looked at me, it all screamed that he wasn't in his right mind. I could feel fear, but I stood my ground. "Go home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You shouldn't be here." He stared at me for a moment, and I could see the gears turning in his head. Then he just nodded, as if he understood. He turned away from me and started walking across the road. I stayed where I was, watching him closely. Something told me not to turn my back on him. He crossed the road and headed towards another group of houses, the ones across from ours. I thought he would leave, But instead, he started snooping around there too, just like he had been doing with the cars. He was checking doors, looking in windows, like he was searching for something. That's when I knew I had to do something more. This wasn't just some lost guy. He was looking for trouble. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called the police. I explained the situation, my voice a bit more frantic than I wanted it to be. The operator assured me they would send someone right away, and I hung up, my eyes never leaving the man. It felt like forever, but eventually I saw the blue and red lights flashing down the road. The man noticed them too, but instead of running, he just stood there, almost like he was expecting them. The police got out of their car and approached him cautiously. They asked him for ID, but he refused to give them any. He just stood there, staring at them with those wide, empty eyes. The officers exchanged a look, then moved in to take him away. He didn't resist, didn't say a word as they put him in the back of the police car. As they drove away, the silence returned, even more profound than before. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to me. This was supposed to be a safe place, but that night I realized that nowhere is ever truly safe. There's always a darkness lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I was 18 years old, and it was 1 a.m. I found myself standing on an empty highway, my thumb out, hoping for a ride. The road stretched out before me, a long dark ribbon cutting through the night. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I could feel the cold air biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to get home. I had been visiting a friend in a small town about 50 miles away and had lost track of time. My friend offered to let me stay the night, but I refused. I thought I could make it home before it got too late. But now, here I was, stranded on this deserted highway in the middle of the night. There were no streetlights, no cars, and no signs of life anywhere, just me and the darkness. Minutes passed, then what felt like hours. I began to worry that no one would come. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I was starting to feel desperate when I saw headlights in the distance. A car was approaching, and it was slowing down. Relief washed over me as the car pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down the window, and I could see it was an old man, his face lined with wrinkles and his hair stark white. "Need a ride?" he asked in a gravelly voice. I hesitated for a moment, but the cold and the fear of being alone on that highway won out. I nodded and got into the car, closing the door behind me. The old man smiled, his teeth yellowed and uneven. He put the car in gear and started driving, the engine humming softly. At first, the ride was quiet. The old man didn't say much, and I was grateful for that. I didn't feel like talking. I just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. The road was empty, and the car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees on either side of us. The shadows they cast seemed to dance and twist, playing tricks on my eyes. The old man broke the silence. "So, where are you heading?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Home," I replied, keeping my voice low. "It's about 30 miles from here." "I see. You live with your parents?" "Yes," I answered, feeling a bit uneasy. I didn't want to share too much information with a stranger, but I didn't want to be rude either. He nodded, as if considering something. "You must be a good kid, going home this late. Don't see many young folks doing that these days." I forced a smile, though I wasn't sure why. Something about the way he talked put me on edge, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. He was just a harmless old man, probably lonely and wanting to talk. But then his questions started getting more personal. "So, what do your parents do for a living?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "They work," I said vaguely. "What kind of work?" he pressed, his eyes flicking toward me for a moment before returning to the road. They're in business," I replied, trying to keep my answers as short as possible. My discomfort was growing with each question, but I didn't want to show it. The old man nodded again, but this time his smile seemed off. It didn't reach his eyes, and something was unsettling about it. My heart started to race, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. I glanced down at his hands on the steering wheel and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were dark stains on his clothes, smeared across his shirt and the cuffs of his sleeves. It looked like dried blood. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel an unnerving sensation in my mind. "Is that blood?" I asked, my voice trembling. The old man didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "It's not mine," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. His words sent a wave of fear crashing over me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who was this man? What had he done? I could feel panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I knew I needed to get out of that car. I had to get away from him before something terrible happened. But we were still on that empty highway, with no other cars in sight, no houses, no help. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I mustered up the courage to speak. "Please let me out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man didn't respond right away. He just kept driving, the road stretching out endlessly before us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a hammer against my ribs. I was terrified he wouldn't let me go, that he had other plans for me. But after a few moments, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice low and gruff. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and stopped. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I quickly opened the door and stepped out, my legs shaking as I stood on the cold asphalt. "Thank you," I muttered, barely able to get the words out. Then, without looking back, I started walking down the road, my heart racing. I heard the car door close behind me and the sound of the engine as the old man drove away. I didn't stop until I was sure he was gone. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I made it home that night, unharmed, but the fear lingered long after I had closed the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The memory of that ride haunted me for weeks. The old man's unsettling questions, the blood on his clothes, his too calm voice. Even now, years later, I can still feel the terror of that night. I've never hitchhiked again, and I never will. Some things aren't worth the risk.